It is tempting to believe that the National Football League was always destined for greatness. The empire feels eternal now, its grip on American life unshakable. Sundays belong to football. The Super Bowl is bigger than most national holidays. Franchises are worth billions, and the league reaches across oceans with broadcasts in dozens of languages. From the outside, it looks inevitable. But inevitability is a myth. The NFL was not born powerful. It was fragile, uncertain, a precarious experiment clinging to survival. And in 1945, on the edge of World War and national exhaustion, the league came closer to folding than most fans will ever realize. The game itself was unrecognizable compared to today. Players wore leather helmets with no face masks. They played both offense and defense. They earned a few $100s for a season, often less than they made in their weekday jobs. They weren't icons, they weren't celebrities. They were steelworkers, teachers, or factory hands who laced up on Sundays because they loved the game and because a little extra money kept food on the table. Crowds were modest. Stadiums often half empty. Professional football trailed far behind baseball, boxing, and college football in the American imagination. To many, it was a curiosity, a sideshow. Then came the war. After Pearl Harbor, the country mobilized, and football's fragile structure cracked immediately. Young men walked into draft boards or volunteered for service, and NFL rosters evaporated. By 1943, more than 600 players and coaches were in uniform overseas. The league was left with scraps. The Cleveland Rams, unable to gather enough men or money, suspended operations altogether. The Philadelphia Eagles and Pittsburgh Steelers were forced into an arranged marriage, fielding a hybrid squad known awkwardly as the Steagles. It was survival in name only, a patchwork solution that symbolized the desperation of the moment. The league did not thrive in those years. Crowds shrank as wartime rationing restricted travel and entertainment. Owners counted coins to pay salaries. Some wondered aloud if the game should be suspended until peace returned. Others believed professional football might never return at all. The NFL became, at best, a background hum during the roar of war. And yet, somehow, it persisted. Replacement players filled rosters. Men who worked in shipyards or factories by day suited up by night. Teams endured humiliating defeats and skeletal schedules, but they played on, if only to prove that life at home could continue. The NFL became a fragile reminder of normalcy in a world consumed by chaos. But the reality was that it stood on the brink. By the winter of 1945, America was shifting again. Hitler's empire was collapsing. Soldiers prepared to come home. The country braced for an uncertain peace. And the NFL found itself staring into the abyss. Surviving the war years had not solved its deeper problems. Owners were broke. Attendance remained low. Competitors were circling. The All-America Football Conference, a rival league flush with new money and ambitious vision, was preparing to launch. Its franchises would stretch from San Francisco to Miami. Its salaries dwarfed what the NFL could offer. If the old league stumbled now, the AAFC was positioned to bury it. The season of 1945 played out under this shadow. Washington, powered by legendary quarterback Sammy Baugh, remained a powerhouse. In Cleveland, a young rookie quarterback named Bob Waterfield carried the Rams, a team that had only recently come back from suspension. The Rams were talented but fragile, beloved locally but ignored nationally. Their owner, Dan Reeves, was restless. He knew Cleveland was not big enough to carry his dreams. Yet first came the championship. On December 16, 1945, fewer than 33,000 fans filled the icy bleachers of Cleveland Municipal Stadium. The weather was brutal, the kind that stiffened hands and turned breath into fog. The crowd huddled under blankets. The game was sloppy, conditions miserable. But Bob Waterfield rose above it. He threw precise passes through the cold air, guided the Rams' offense and carried them to a narrow 15-14 victory over Washington. For Cleveland, it was a moment of triumph, the city's first taste of professional football glory. Yet the celebration barely lasted. Days later, Reeves dropped his bombshell. He was moving the Rams to Los Angeles. For the first time, a professional football franchise would abandon its home city and travel across the continent. For the first time, the NFL would step into California, chasing opportunity in the booming West. The decision shocked the league. Some saw it as reckless, others saw it as betrayal. But history would prove it transformative. Los Angeles was more than a city. It was the future. Post-war America was already shifting westward. California was swelling with veterans, dreamers, and families looking for new beginnings. It was also the capital of entertainment, the home of Hollywood, the stage for television's rapid rise. By planting a flag there, Reeves tied the NFL to the forces that would define America's cultural future. Television would amplify the game. Hollywood would shape its image. Los Angeles would make professional football glamorous. But in that fragile winter of 1945, none of this was guaranteed. To many, the move seemed like madness. The Rams were abandoning a loyal fan base. Travel costs would skyrocket. No team had ever survived on the West Coast. If Los Angeles failed, Reeves would ruin not only his franchise, but perhaps the league itself. The NFL's future hinged on whether one desperate gamble could succeed. That is the truth we forget when we look at today's empire. We forget how close it came to disappearing. We forget that for much of its history, the NFL was a league of instability, of financial ruin, of desperate measures to keep the doors open. We forget that in 1945, it was small enough to fail. The story of 1945 is the story of fragility and survival. It is the story of how a battered league, drained by war and ignored by much of the country, found a way to endure. It is the story of owners willing to gamble, of players who returned from combat to play for meager wages, of fans who never realized how close the game was to extinction. And it is the story of a single decision, the Rams' move west, that cracked open the future. When you peel away the myth of inevitability, when you strip back the billion-dollar spectacle and the global reach, you find this moment. The winter of 1945, a league shivering in the cold, staring at its last chance. The National Football League was not supposed to survive, but it did. And the world would never be the same. The year was 1945. The NFL faced its last chance. The year was 1945. A war was ending overseas, but on the home front, another battle was unfolding, one that would determine whether professional football in America would live or die. When we talk about the National Football League today, we picture a billion-dollar empire, packed stadiums, primetime broadcasts, Super Bowl Sunday as a national holiday. But in 1945, there was no such certainty. The NFL was fragile, strapped for money, and fighting for cultural relevance in a country that still saw college football and baseball as the true giants of sport. I look back on those years not as a story of inevitability, but as a razor's edge. Every dollar mattered. Every fan in the stands was a victory. Every headline in the newspaper, good or bad, could tip the balance of whether the league survived another year. The Second World War had drained the league of its lifeblood, its players. By 1943, over 1,000 professional football players had left the game to serve in the armed forces. Teams were gutted, rosters collapsed, and franchises scrambled to field enough men to even play on Sundays. The Philadelphia Eagles and Pittsburgh Steelers were forced into a temporary merger, the Steagles, a desperate move to stay afloat. Washington fielded players who were well past their prime. Chicago, Green Bay, and New York leaned on anyone who could suit up. The sport limped forward, but barely. When victory finally came in 1945, it didn't mean stability. It meant the league faced an uncertain reckoning. Soldiers would return home, but would they return to football? Fans who had endured rationing and sacrifice were ready for entertainment. But would they choose the NFL? Or would baseball, boxing, and college football reclaim their dominance? And behind closed doors, the NFL's owners wrestled with a sobering reality. The league had lost money in nearly every major market. Franchises were folding, relocating, or dissolving under debt. The Chicago Cardinals, once proud, were struggling to sell tickets. The Boston Yanks never caught on. The Cleveland Rams, despite winning the 1945 NFL championship, would uproot their franchise weeks later and move to Los Angeles, chasing survival on the West Coast. It's easy from the vantage point of today to assume football's rise was destiny. But the facts tell a different story. In 1945, the NFL's financial records showed losses across most of its teams. Crowds averaged fewer than 20,000 per game, a number dwarfed by the legions who filled college stadiums. Players earned meager wages, often working second jobs in the off-season just to make ends meet. The league's survival hinged not on dominance, but on stubborn persistence and a few pivotal decisions that would reshape the trajectory of the sport. One of those decisions was expansion. When the Rams bolted to Los Angeles in 1946, the NFL became the first professional sports league to plant a permanent franchise on the Pacific Coast. It was risky. Even reckless Los Angeles was far from the league's Midwestern and Northeastern roots. And travel logistics seemed impossible in an era when cross-country flights were rare and expensive. But the gamble paid off. The Rams captured the imagination of a new market, drawing attention from Hollywood celebrities and bringing professional football into the national conversation. It was one of the league's first signs that survival meant boldness, not caution. But expansion also exposed cracks. The war had created a generation of hungry athletes, many of whom sought opportunities beyond the NFL's limited rosters and low pay. That hunger fueled the birth of a rival, the All-America Football Conference, or AAFC. Backed by wealthy businessmen, the AAFC launched in 1946 and immediately challenged the NFL head-to-head. They offered higher salaries, better benefits, and opportunities for black players at a time when the NFL remained segregated. The Cleveland Browns, under coach Paul Brown, emerged as a powerhouse, drawing crowds larger than most NFL teams. The existence of the AAFC threatened to split professional football in two. And for a time, it looked as if the NFL might not survive the competition. This, then, was the crucible of 1945 and its aftermath. The NFL teetered on collapse. Its future contested not just on the field, but in boardrooms, newspapers, and the hearts of American fans. The story of how the league clawed its way from irrelevance to dominance is not simply about games played on autumn Sundays. It is about war, culture, money, and identity. It is about how a sport woven into the fabric of small-town America fought to prove it deserved a place on the national stage. To understand the gravity of this era, you have to imagine the atmosphere of post-war America. Soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific were looking for stability. Families were reuniting after years of separation. Cities swelled with optimism, industry boomed, and leisure activities became a way to reclaim normalcy. Entertainment mattered more than ever. Baseball was still America's pastime. College football packed stadiums from South Bend to Ann Arbor, drawing national radio audiences. Professional football, by contrast, was an afterthought. Sports writers openly wondered whether the league would even exist in a decade. And yet, the NFL had something different. The game itself, faster, more brutal, more dramatic than college football lovered. A raw intensity that mirrored the grit of post-war America. Players didn't just represent schools, they represented survival. They played for meager pay, in battered equipment, with little medical protection. The drama wasn't polished. It was visceral. That authenticity, though not fully recognized in the moment, planted the seeds of the league's eventual growth. Still, the obstacles were immense. Owners quarreled over finances. Stadium leases drained profits. Media coverage was inconsistent at best, dismissive at worst. In some cities, NFL franchises were barely considered professional. Teams like the Brooklyn Tigers or the Boston Yanks became symbols of failure, drawing small crowds and constant ridicule. For every Green Bay or Chicago that held loyal fan bases, there were markets where the NFL was one bad season away from folding entirely. This is the theme of the story we are about to explore. Not inevitability, but fragility. Not triumph, but near collapse. The NFL's journey through the mid-1940s was one of desperate improvisation, of holding the line long enough for fortune and timing to shift. Without the resilience of owners willing to absorb losses, without the gamble of expansion to Los Angeles, without the looming challenge of the AAFC forcing the NFL to evolve, the league we know today might never have existed. As I take you through this story, we will explore each chapter of this precarious era in detail. We will look at the state of the league during the war years, when rosters were gutted by military service. We will examine the financial records and stadium struggles that nearly bankrupted teams. We will analyze the Rams' bold move to Los Angeles and its ripple effects on professional sports. We will confront the challenge of the AAFC and how its competition forced the NFL to adapt or die. And we will hear the voices of players, journalists, and historians who lived through or studied this moment, piecing together how close the NFL came to extinction. This documentary is not about glorifying what happened. It is about uncovering the reality of how fragile the NFL once was. When we talk about football's dark side, we often think of scandals, injuries, or controversies. But the true dark side of 1945 was uncertainty itself. The league's survival was not guaranteed, and every decision carried the weight of an entire sport's future. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you'll see the NFL of today in a different light. You'll understand that its empire was built not on inevitability, but on desperation, survival, and chance. You'll recognize that the glory of Sunday football is rooted in a history of near failure. And you'll grasp that in 1945. The league's last chance was exactly that, a final opportunity to prove that professional football belonged in America's heart. This is the story of the NFL's narrow escape, its last chance in 1945, and the fragile foundation on which a billion-dollar empire was built. The story of the NFL's near collapse in 1945 begins long before that fateful year. To understand just how close the league came to dissolving, we have to step back into the early 1940s. When the Second World War reshaped every aspect of American life, including professional football. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the ripple effects hit the NFL almost immediately. Within months, young men across the country volunteered or were drafted into service. The war effort consumed the nation's attention, industry, and manpower. And professional football players were not exempt. Nearly every roster in the league was decimated. By 1943, estimates suggest that more than 1,000 current and former professional football players were serving in the armed forces. These were not fringe names. They were stars, Pro Bowlers, and household figures. Sid Luckman, the celebrated quarterback of the Chicago Bears, balanced his career with his duties in the Merchant Marine. Bill Dudley, an all-pro halfback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, served as a pilot in the Army Air Corps. Dozens of others left behind bright careers to join the fight. For the league, this meant fewer skilled athletes to field competitive teams. For the players, it meant risking not just their football careers, but their lives. The war years forced the NFL into a state of improvisation. Some teams folded temporarily. The Cleveland Rams suspended operations for the entire 1943 season. Other franchises sought emergency solutions. The Philadelphia Eagles and Pittsburgh Steelers, both gutted by enlistments, merged to form a single team, the Steagles, for one season. This hybrid franchise limped through the schedule, a symbol of how desperate things had become. Even that arrangement proved difficult as the cultures of the two organizations clashed and players had to wear different helmets in practice simply to distinguish who was who. This period revealed the razor-thin margins on which the NFL operated. Unlike baseball, which had deeper pockets and a stronger cultural foothold, professional football was a fragile experiment. College football thrived during these years, drawing enormous crowds and national radio audiences. The NFL, by contrast, looked like a sideshow wonderland, underfunded and overshadowed by a war it could never compete with. Attendance figures tell the story starkly. In 1943, average attendance across the league dropped to around 16,000 fans per game. Some markets fared worse. The Brooklyn Dodgers of the NFL, not to be confused with the baseball team, played in front of crowds that barely filled a corner of Ebbets Field. The Boston Yanks, a struggling franchise founded in 1944, often drew fewer than 10,000 spectators, with empty seats outnumbering paying customers. Each home game was less a celebration of sport than a gamble on whether the franchise could survive the season. Yet, the league pressed on. It had to. NFL Commissioner Elmer Layden, a former member of Notre Dame's Four Horsemen, believed that maintaining professional football even in its weakened state was important for national morale. He argued that football on Sundays offered Americans a sense of continuity, a brief escape from the anxieties of wartime. His insistence kept the league alive, but the financial reality was grim. Owners were losing money, borrowing against their own businesses, and questioning whether it made sense to keep going. The war didn't just affect rosters and finances, it changed the quality of the game itself. Teams filled vacancies with players who might never have made an NFL roster under normal circumstances. Semi-pros, men past their prime. Even athletes with physical limitations were pressed into service. The product on the field was often sloppy, a far cry from the polished dominance of earlier dynasties like the Bears of the late 1930s. Fans noticed. Sports writers criticized the league as diluted, uninspiring, a pale imitation of college football. Still, there were flashes of resilience. The Chicago Bears, led by coach George Halas before he left for military service, had established themselves as innovators with the T formation offense. Even as rosters weakened, the strategic evolution of the game continued. Teams like the Washington Redskins, with quarterback Sammy Baugh, showed glimpses of brilliance. These sparks suggested that professional football still had something to offer, but whether it would survive long enough to prove it was another question entirely. By 1944 and 1945, the war was grinding toward its conclusion, but the NFL's situation was not improving. The league added the Boston Yanks in 1944, a move intended to expand its footprint. Instead, it became a burden. The team was poorly supported, financially unstable, and consistently uncompetitive. Other franchises faced similar struggles. The Brooklyn Tigers finished the 1944 season winless and merged with the Boston Yanks the following year. Stability was a mirage. As the war dragged on, the question grew louder. Would there even be an NFL to come back to when peace returned? Owners feared that fans, accustomed to college rivalries and the established rhythms of baseball, would simply ignore professional football. The league's financial reports for 1945 confirmed those fears. While some teams managed to break even, most were operating at losses. For every Green Bay, where community support was unwavering, there were franchises like Boston and Brooklyn that looked like ticking clocks. And then came the turning point, though it didn't feel like one at the time. In December 1945, the Cleveland Rams faced the Washington Redskins in the NFL championship game, played in freezing conditions at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. The game drew just over 32,000 fans, respectable crowd, but hardly a defining moment in sports history. What made it historic was what happened afterward. Cleveland Rams owner Don Reeves, weary of financial losses and skeptical of his team's future in Ohio, announced that he was moving the franchise to Los Angeles. It was a radical move, unprecedented in professional sports. No major league had ever stretched its boundaries to the Pacific Coast. At the time, many considered it reckless. travel was costly. Radio contracts didn't cover the West. The Midwest and East were the sport's cultural backbone. But Reeves saw opportunity where others saw risk. He believed the NFL needed new markets to survive, and Los Angeles, with its growing population, sunny climate, and Hollywood, was the place to start. The relocation stunned the league. Within weeks of winning the NFL championship, Cleveland had lost its team entirely. Local fans were outraged, but the move also signaled something larger: that the NFL's survival might depend on boldness, not caution. By planting a franchise on the West Coast, the league began to redefine its identity not as a regional curiosity, but as a truly national enterprise. The timing was crucial. With soldiers returning home, there was an appetite for entertainment, and Los Angeles provided a glamorous stage. The Rams became a symbol of possibility. The move didn't solve the NFL's immediate financial woes, but it opened a door to growth that had never existed before. It was the first step in transforming the league from a fragile Midwestern experiment into a nationwide spectacle. Still, this was no guarantee of success. The war had ended, but the NFL's problems had not. The league faced stiff competition from other sports, financial instability in several franchises, and, looming on the horizon, a new challenger in the All-America Football Conference. Survival was not secured. If anything, the NFL was about to face its greatest test yet. The story of 1945, then, is not just about games played or championships won. It is about a sport teetering on the brink, forced to reinvent itself in order to endure. It is about the fragility of institutions we now take for granted, and the thin line between collapse and survival. The war had stripped the league bare, exposing its weaknesses. What came next would determine whether professional football remained a sideshow or became a defining part of American life. The Cleveland Rams' departure to Los Angeles in 1946 was more than just a relocation. It was a litmus test for whether the NFL could evolve fast enough to survive. But before that move could even bear fruit, the league faced another challenge, one far greater than geography or finances. In 1946, the NFL found itself staring down an adversary that threatened its very existence: the All-America Football Conference. The AAFC was born out of the same post-war optimism that fueled Don Reeves' bold decision to chase a new market. With soldiers returning home and the American economy booming, investors and businessmen saw opportunity in professional sports. Baseball was already established, but football was viewed as ripe for disruption. The NFL was small, regional, and crucially vulnerable. Enter Arch Ward, a sports editor for the Chicago Tribune. He believed professional football was ready for expansion, but that the NFL was too cautious, too slow, and too conservative to seize the moment. Ward helped organize a group of wealthy backers, including hotel magnates, oilmen, and industrialists, to fund a rival league. From the beginning, the AAFC positioned itself as more ambitious, more innovative, and more daring than the NFL. It planned franchises in major cities: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cleveland, and Miami, immediately giving it a reach that rivaled and in some ways surpassed the NFL's, where the NFL had been content to cluster in the Midwest and Northeast. The AAFC promised coast-to-coast football from day one, but it wasn't just geography. The AAFC offered players better salaries, modern contracts, and in some cases, living stipends. For athletes who had endured years of meager pay in the NFL, this was irresistible. As a result, the AAFC began siphoning away talent at a rate that alarmed the established league. Players who might have settled for $5,000 a year in the NFL could suddenly earn double in the AAFC. For a man supporting a family in post-war America, that wasn't just an offer, was a lifeline. And then there was Paul Brown. His name would become synonymous with innovation. But in 1946, he was a young coach, fresh from leading the Great Lakes Naval Training Station team during the war. Ward and the AAFC recruited him to coach their Cleveland franchise, and he immediately turned it into a laboratory for the future of football. Brown introduced film study to analyze opponents. He implemented full-time assistant coaches at a time when the NFL treated such roles as luxuries. He used playbooks, precise timing patterns, and a level of discipline that mirrored his military background. The result was a team that operated like a machine. That team, the Cleveland Browns, would become the AAFC's crown jewel. In their first season, they went undefeated, crushing opponents with a precision the NFL had rarely seen. Their quarterback, Otto Graham, became the prototype of the modern passer, leading an offense that seemed decades ahead of its time. Fullback Marion Motley, one of the first black players to integrate professional football in the modern era, combined size and speed in a way that left defenses helpless. Alongside guard Bill Willis, Motley's presence was historic. While the NFL remained segregated until 1946, the AAFC opened its doors earlier and more decisively, allowing black players to take the field and thrive. For fans, the AAFC felt fresh, exciting, and progressive. Attendance figures reflected that. In Cleveland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, crowds regularly surpassed those of NFL teams. In New York, the AAFC's Yankees drew more headlines than the NFL's Giants. Within 2 seasons, it was clear that the new league had shaken the foundations of professional football. For the NFL, this was a crisis. The war had already weakened its stability, and now it faced a competitor with deeper pockets and a willingness to innovate. Owners worried not only about losing players, but about losing entire fan bases. Some newspapers openly speculated that the AAFC might overtake the NFL entirely, relegating it to a footnote in sports history. The NFL fought back the only way it knew how: survival through endurance. Its owners slashed costs, tightened operations, and banked on loyalty to weather the storm. Commissioner Bert Bell, who replaced Elmer Layden in 1946, understood the stakes. A former owner himself, Bell was pragmatic and tough. He instituted the draft order system, ensuring weaker teams had a better chance to compete. He prioritized stability, refusing to expand recklessly or chase markets without careful planning. Bell believed that if the NFL could simply outlast the AAFC, the rival league's investors would grow impatient and fold. But the margin was thin. Teams like the Boston Yanks, already struggling, now faced existential threats. Attendance dipped in certain markets, and owners whispered about whether they could survive another season. Meanwhile, the AAFC was splashing headlines with dominant performances and modern tactics. Every week, the contrast between the two leagues seemed starker. The irony is that while the AAFC challenged the NFL's dominance, it also forced the older league to evolve. The presence of Paul Brown's Browns highlighted the NFL's stagnation. Innovations like film study, detailed playbooks, and integrated rosters pressured the NFL to adapt. The competition injected urgency into a sport that had coasted on tradition for too long. Yet the NFL had one advantage the AAFC could never fully match: institutional routes. Its teams, Chicago, Green Bay, New York, Washington, were woven into their communities. Their histories stretched back decades. Fans had grown up with the Bears, the Giants, the Packers. That loyalty, combined with Bell's steady leadership, allowed the NFL to hold its ground, even as the AAFC pressed harder. The clash between the leagues would rage for 4 seasons, but in 1946, it was just beginning. From the perspective of that year, nothing was guaranteed. On one side, a young, hungry, well-funded challenger was rewriting the rules of professional football. On the other, a battered, cautious league was clinging to survival. The outcome was uncertain, and the future of the sport hung in the balance. The NFL had survived a war. But could it survive a rival determined to destroy it? By 1946, the NFL was not only battling for market share, was fighting for credibility. The war years had left deep scars. Rosters were thin, revenues were fragile, and the sudden appearance of the AAFC threatened to expose just how vulnerable the league truly was. The NFL's survival depended on more than loyalty or tradition. It depended on convincing fans, players, and investors that it still deserved to exist. The challenge was immediate and brutal. In cities where both leagues operated, the comparisons were unavoidable. Take New York, for example. The NFL's Giants had been a fixture since 1925, playing their games in the Polo Grounds. They were gritty, tough, and respectable. But suddenly, in 1946, the AAFC's Yankees emerged, promising excitement and star power. Backed by Tex Rickard Jr. and modeled after the glamour of the New York Yankees baseball team, the football Yankees tried to capture the same cultural cachet. Their uniforms were sharp, their rosters competitive, and their marketing savvy. Newspapers in New York devoted as much ink to the newcomers as they did to the Giants. To a fan picking up a ticket on a fall weekend, the question became real. Which game do you attend? Which team do you support? In Cleveland, the contrast was even sharper. The Rams had just left for Los Angeles, abandoning a fan base that felt betrayed. Into that void stepped the Cleveland Browns of the AAFC. Led by Paul Brown and quarterback Otto Graham, they became instant sensations. In their very first season, they drew more than 60,000 fans to Municipal Stadium, a number the NFL could only dream of at the time. The Browns weren't just good. They were dominant. They executed plays with precision. Their defense was suffocating, and their coaching was revolutionary. For Cleveland fans, the choice was simple. Support the team that stayed, not the one that left. This exposed a deeper truth. The NFL, for all its history, was not untouchable. Its grip on markets could be broken. Its brand could be outshone. And in cities like Cleveland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, the AAFC was not just competition, it was winning the cultural battle. But the NFL still had its strongholds. Chicago, Green Bay, Washington, and Philadelphia remained loyal. George Halas's Bears were still a powerhouse, a franchise that carried weight in both history and performance. Curly Lambeau's Packers had small-town grit and community pride that no rival could replicate. In Washington, Sammy Baugh was a star who commanded national headlines. In Philadelphia, the Eagles were building a foundation that would soon produce a championship. These teams represented continuity, and they gave the NFL a base to stand on, even as the storm gathered. Commissioner Bert recognized that survival meant more than just holding ground. He needed to tighten the league's structure. One of his most significant moves was the institution of a true player draft system. The concept had been introduced earlier, but Bell refined it into the model we recognize today. The weakest teams would pick first, ensuring competitive balance. In an era where wealthy owners and rival leagues could lure talent with higher salaries, the draft was a way to create stability. It gave struggling franchises a fighting chance to rebuild. Still, Bell faced criticism. Owners wanted immediate solutions, not long-term planning. Some called for aggressive expansion to counter the AAFC. Others argued the league should cut costs further, even if it meant shrinking. Bell refused to panic. His philosophy was patience. He believed the AAFC, with its heavy spending, would eventually overextend itself. If the NFL could weather the short-term storm, the rival league would collapse under its own weight. It was a calculated gamble, one that required not only financial discipline, but a belief that fans would not abandon the NFL entirely. And yet, the cracks widened. Attendance figures painted an uneasy picture. In 1946, the NFL averaged just under 25,000 fans per game. The AAFC, meanwhile, often outdrew them in major markets. The press picked up on this narrative. Columnists in major newspapers questioned whether the NFL could compete. Some declared that the Browns, even though they weren't technically an NFL team, were the best professional football squad in America. These weren't empty claims. Their dominance was undeniable. Otto Graham was redefining the quarterback position. Marion Motley was a bulldozer in the backfield, and Paul Brown's coaching innovations set a new standard. The NFL had no immediate answer. Players, too, began to see the AAFC as the more attractive option. Better pay, better conditions, and the chance to be part of something exciting drew them west and south. Owners in the NFL scrambled to retain their stars, sometimes doubling or tripling offers just to keep pace. It was an arms race, one that threatened to bankrupt smaller franchises. For some teams like the Brooklyn Dodgers or the Boston Yanks, the competition was simply too much. They became the weakest links in the NFL's chain, constant reminders of how fragile the league remained. And yet, amid the uncertainty, there were moments that revealed why the NFL might endure. Rivalries, for one. The Bears and Packers still carried a weight of tradition that no new league could match. Fans in Wisconsin weren't going to abandon Green Bay for a team in a different city. Chicago's love for Halisa's Bears was deeper than any novelty the AAFC could provide. Tradition mattered. And in professional sports, tradition often wins in the long run. There was also the matter of media contracts. The NFL, though financially weaker, retained better relationships with newspapers and radio broadcasters. Coverage was uneven, but the league's established presence gave it a legitimacy that the AAFC still had to earn. Bell leveraged those connections carefully, ensuring that the NFL's story continued to be told, even as its rival made headlines. Still, the sense of fragility was everywhere. In 1946 and 1947, the NFL's owners lived season to season, never certain if the balance sheets would hold. Losses piled up in some cities, and whispers of mergers or foldings hung in the air. If 2 or 3 franchises collapsed, it could trigger a domino effect, undermining the league's stability entirely. The AAFC, meanwhile, seemed flush with optimism, handing out contracts and drawing crowds that embarrassed the older league. From today's perspective, it's easy to assume the NFL would survive. But in 1946, the future was a coin toss. The Browns looked unstoppable, the AAFC looked modern, and the NFL looked tired. For the first time in its history, professional football's original league faced the real possibility of being replaced. The NFL had survived the war. But could it survive being outperformed on its own soil? That was the question in the late 1940s, and the answer was anything but obvious. I often think about what kept the National Football League alive in those years. What thin threads held it together when the very structure of the sport seemed ready to collapse? By the early 1940s, those threads weren't made of leather footballs or chalk lines. They were made of cash, or more precisely, the lack of it. The truth is brutal. The league almost died because it couldn't afford to live. Football, for all its spirit, was an economic gamble. And by 1945, that gamble was seconds away from busting. In the 1930s, the NFL was little more than a collection of struggling franchises scattered across the Midwest and Northeast. Teams like the Portsmouth Spartans, who couldn't draw enough fans to pay their bills, had to sell themselves to Detroit, becoming the Lions. The Brooklyn Dodgers, once a football team as well as a baseball club, couldn't find footing in a market already saturated with distractions. Most franchises barely scraped by on ticket sales, praying for good weather and hoping their star player didn't get hurt. There was no television money, no billion-dollar sponsors, no fantasy football driving fan obsession. Revenues came almost exclusively from the gate, and the gate depended entirely on whether fans thought the spectacle was worth their scarce dollars. By 1942, that system was crumbling. War rationing meant fewer families could afford tickets. Stadiums that once held 30,000 might see only half that number on Sundays. In Chicago, George Halas and his Bears were lucky. They were winners, dynastic in their dominance, and fans still came. But in smaller markets like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, survival was a week-to-week affair. Owners covered losses out of their own pockets. Or worse, borrowed money they weren't sure they could ever repay. The NFL was not yet a business empire. It was a string of small businesses bleeding cash in the middle of an economic war zone. Consider the Philadelphia Eagles, run by Alexis Thompson, a wealthy man with vision, but also the burden of wartime uncertainty. Thompson had inherited a fragile operation, poor attendance, limited resources, and no real market dominance in a city that already lived and breathed baseball. By 1943, the Eagles couldn't even field a team. They merged with the Pittsburgh Steelers, creating the makeshift Steagles. It was a desperate experiment, born not of innovation, but necessity. Imagine that today's two NFL franchises, blending rosters, uniforms, even coaching staffs, simply because they couldn't survive alone. That was the economic reality of football in 1943. The Steelers themselves were no better. Art Rooney had poured his life into the team, but he had little to show for it beyond debts and headaches. At one point, he sold the franchise just to keep afloat, later buying his way back in through a complicated shuffle with the Chicago Cardinals. It was musical chairs with ownership titles, all driven by the same underlying problem. Football didn't make money. The margins were razor thin, and the war only shaved them further. The Cleveland Rams provide perhaps the clearest picture of this fragility. By 1943, they had suspended operations entirely, unable to continue with players drafted and fans distracted. Dan Reeves, the owner, considered abandoning the sport altogether. What saved him was not profitability, but persistence. He believed the NFL had a future, even if the present looked bleak. But belief doesn't pay salaries or stadium leases. Every home game was a financial risk, every road trip a calculated gamble. In cities like Cleveland, where resources were scarce and priorities lay elsewhere, Reeves knew he was playing a dangerous game with survival. It's important to remember what NFL economics meant at that time. Players earned modest wages, often less than what they could make in the factories. The war sharpened this knife's edge. Travel restrictions meant teams had to take buses instead of trains. Equipment shortages made uniforms harder to replace. Inflation eroded what little revenue came in. Stadium deals, already tenuous, became points of friction as cities prioritized military needs over sports. Owners leaned on personal wealth if they had it, or prayed for a miracle if they didn't. Some mortgaged homes, others begged creditors for more time. Each Sunday game was less about who won or lost on the field, and more about whether the league itself could survive to play again next week. And yet, there was something almost poetic in this fragility. Because despite the odds, the NFL endured. Fans still came, not in droves, but in enough numbers to keep the dream flickering. A factory worker in Pittsburgh might give up a hard-earned dollar just to see the Steelers play, if only for the escape. A Cleveland boy, whose brothers were overseas, might drag his father to a Rams game as a reminder of normalcy. The stands weren't packed, but they weren't empty either. And every ticket mattered. Every single coin dropped at the gate was another heartbeat for the league. The NFL's financial crisis also sparked creativity. The Steagles, as awkward as they were, represented collaboration in the face of collapse. The league cut corners, reduced rosters, and experimented with scheduling just to survive. What would one day be hailed as adaptability was, in truth, born of desperation. The NFL was fighting not for profit, but for existence. It's easy to forget that in 1945, the NFL was not the premier football attraction in America. College football held that crown. On Saturdays, massive crowds filled stadiums in the South, the Midwest, and the Northeast, cheering for schools with far deeper traditions and far stronger followings. The Army-Navy game drew tens of thousands, while NFL contests often looked sparse by comparison. Sports writers of the time didn't hesitate to say it. Professional football was the little brother, always chasing the shadow of college glory. In that environment, trying to charge fans for Sunday tickets was an uphill climb. Why pay to see the Steelers or Eagles when you could watch Notre Dame or Army dominate the headlines? The economic landscape was brutal, but it was also clarifying. to reveal just how fragile the dream of professional football really was. It wasn't a booming industry. It was a fragile experiment balanced on wartime sacrifice, fan loyalty, and sheer stubbornness. The NFL of 1945 was not inevitable. It was not destined to succeed. It was one bad season, one failed team, one financial collapse away from disappearing into history as a forgotten sports league that couldn't compete with the times. When I reflect on those days, I realize that the survival of the NFL was as much about grit off the field as it was about toughness on it. Owners who mortgaged their futures, players who accepted meager wages, and fans who partied with their scarce dollars, they were all investors in a fragile dream, a dream that nearly collapsed under the weight of its own economics. And yet, somehow, it endured. The question is why? What forces allowed a league so financially unstable, so overshadowed by college football, so weakened by war, to cling to life? The answer lies not just in economics, but in resilience, the kind of resilience that would define the NFL for generations to come. The NFL's story of survival in 1945 cannot be told without reckoning with the men who played the game and, more importantly, the ones who didn't. Because in the middle of World War II, the league faced not just financial collapse, but physical depletion. The rosters themselves were gutted, emptied by the military draft and the patriotic call to service. What remained on the field was a fragile patchwork of two young recruits, two old veterans and men deemed unfit for war, but desperate to play football. It was the strangest, thinnest player pool professional football had ever seen. And it nearly broke the league. When America entered the war in December of 1941, the consequences for the NFL were immediate. Within months, names that had lit up the scoreboard were gone, traded for military uniforms. The Chicago Bears, once stacked with talent, lost stars like Sid Luckman to the Merchant Marine. The Washington Redskins watched linemen disappear into the Army. Across the league, coaches opened their locker rooms in July and found them half empty by August. The selective service draft took no account of sporting schedules. If you were of age and fit to serve, you were gone. Entire depth charts collapsed overnight. Owners scrambled to fill lineups, scouring colleges, semi-pro circuits, even high school ranks for bodies to wear the uniform. By 1943, the league had fewer than 300 active players to spread across 10 teams. To put that in perspective, today's NFL keeps nearly 1,700 men on active rosters. The wartime NFL was playing with scraps. What scraps? Exactly. Men like Ed Michaels, a 35-year-old lineman pressed back into service years after his prime, suiting up again simply because there were no alternatives. Or Tony Bova, a half-blind receiver who wore glasses beneath his helmet, but still lined up for the Steagles. Players with medical exemptions, bad knees, poor eyesight, weak hearts suddenly found themselves in demand. Not despite their conditions, but because of them. If you could stand upright and take a hit, you had a place in the league. The league's desperation led to one of the most unusual seasons in its history. 1943, when the Philadelphia Eagles and Pittsburgh Steelers merged. The so-called Steagles were less a team than a wartime compromise. They practiced in split cities, wore a combination of uniforms, and shared coaches who barely agreed on strategy. The roster was a motley crew of young men just out of school, aging veterans pulled from retirement, and oddities like Bova. Against all odds, the Steagles won 5 games, finishing with a winning record. But their existence told the darker truth. Individually, neither the Eagles nor Steelers could have survived the season, and they weren't alone. That same year, the Chicago Cardinals and Pittsburgh Steelers attempted a merger of their own, creating the Card-Pitt team. It was a disaster. The roster was so talent-poor that opponents mocked them as the Carpets because everyone walked all over them. They finished 0-10, outscored by more than 200 points, and barely fielded a competitive product. Yet the fact that such an experiment was even attempted underscored how dire the NFL's roster crisis had become. Teams were not merging for fun. they were merging to survive. The quality of play inevitably declined. Sports writers of the era noted the obvious. Games were sloppy, mistakes rampant, and the spectacle often uninspiring. Passing attacks sputtered with outskilled quarterbacks. Linemen were undersized, sometimes weighing less than 200 pounds because the bigger, stronger athletes were overseas. Coaches simplified playbooks, cutting out complex strategies because their rosters lacked the talent or continuity to execute them. The NFL of 1943 and 1944 was football stripped to its bare bones a survival game for both players and teams. Yet, within this weakness lay stories of grit. Consider the case of Bob Waterfield, a rookie quarterback for the Cleveland Rams in 1945. Unlike so many of his peers, Waterfield had avoided military service due to a family hardship deferment. His presence gave the Rams a stability few teams enjoyed. That year, he led the Rams to a championship, throwing passes with the calm poise of a veteran. But Waterfield was an exception, a rare star in a league starving for them. Most rosters had no such luxury. The war also shifted the very culture of professional football. For the first time, the league leaned heavily on men who had been told by doctors or draft boards that they weren't fit for military service. This created a paradox. Men too weak, too sick, or too injured for war were suddenly tough enough for the NFL. Fans sometimes mocked this irony, but the league had no choice. It was a matter of filling rosters, of putting 11 men on the field no matter who they were. Players themselves understood the absurdity. Tony Bova once quipped that the only reason he was catching passes on Sundays was because Uncle Sam didn't want him catching bombs overseas. These men knew they weren't the ideal athletes, but they played anyway, giving the league just enough substance to keep the turnstiles spinning. The wartime rosters also forced owners to reconsider their relationship with college football. Traditionally, college had been the breeding ground for NFL talent, but now those same colleges were losing men to the war. The pipeline dried up. Draft classes were weak, sometimes laughably so. In 1944, the Chicago Bears used their first-round pick on Angelo Bertelli, a Heisman Trophy winner from Notre Dame who was already serving in the Marines. He never played it down for them. Picks became gambles, little more than names on paper that might never materialize in uniform. Amid this instability, one truth emerged. The NFL was hanging by a thread, but it refused to snap. Coaches improvised, players endured, and fans, though they noticed the decline in quality, still came. They came because the NFL offered more than just football. It offered normalcy, a distraction from the brutal headlines overseas. Even if the rosters were makeshift, the game itself still meant something. And when the war finally began to wind down in 1945, there was cautious hope. Stars would return, rosters would refill. The league might once again look like the professional product it aspired to be. But that return was not guaranteed. Many who went to war never came back. Others returned broken, their athletic primes lost to battlefields instead of gridirons. The NFL would not emerge from the war unscathed. It would emerge scarred, stitched together by the unlikely stories of the men who played when almost no one else could. When I think back on those wartime rosters, I see more than desperation. I see resilience. The league could have folded. It could have admitted the obvious that the product was too thin, the talent too weak, the spectacle too diminished. But it didn't. It pushed forward, ugly as it was, because quitting meant extinction. And in those fragile years, survival was victory enough. Yet, survival brought its own question. If the NFL had only just managed to field teams during the war, what would happen when peace returned? Would fans, used to cheering for Army, Navy, or Notre Dame, still care for a league that had barely limped through the conflict? Would players who had seen war return to football or turn their backs on the sport? The answers would determine whether the NFL could reclaim its dignity or fade into. History as a wartime curiosity that outlived its moment. The spring of 1945 brought a strange silence to America. Victory in Europe was declared, but the war in the Pacific raged on. Communities celebrated in the streets, yet black draped the doors of families who had lost sons. It was a nation caught between joy and grief, relief and exhaustion. For the National Football League, that same spring carried both promise and peril. The soldiers were coming home, and with them came the question that would decide the league's future. Could professional football matter in a world that had just endured the largest war in human history? By the end of the conflict, more than 1,000 NFL players had served in the armed forces. Some were household names. Bill Dudley, Bullet Bill of the Pittsburgh Steelers, had paused his career to join the Army Air Corps. Sid Luckman, the brilliant quarterback of the Chicago Bears, balanced his NFL duties with military service. Others gave everything men, like Jack Lummis of the New York Giants, who earned the Medal of Honor posthumously after dying in the Battle of Iwo Jima. The league's connection to the war was not symbolic, was lived in the blood of its athletes. When those men returned, they were not the same. Some bore physical scars, shrapnel wounds, damaged joints, chronic pain that no doctor could truly mend. Others carried invisible burdens, nightmares of combat, the weight of friends lost. Professional football, by comparison, seemed trivial. How do you run a simple off-tackle play when you've stormed beaches under fire? How do you find intensity in the clash of helmets when you've seen tanks roar across Europe? The war had matured them, aged them, hardened them in ways that football never could. And yet, many came back eager to play. Football, after all, had always been tied to identity. It was a chance to reclaim a piece of themselves, to return to something familiar in a world forever changed. Fans, too, were eager for their return. They wanted to see stars like Dudley, Luckman, and Steve Van Buren back on the field, bringing legitimacy to a league that had limped through the war with half-blind receivers and 35-year-old linemen. But the return of soldiers posed challenges. Rosters swelled with men suddenly eligible again, and competition for jobs intensified. Veterans who had played during the war years, the too old, exempt, the medically unfit now, found themselves shoved aside by stronger, younger men, fresh from service. It was the cruel cycle of professional sports accelerated by war. Yesterday's saviors became today's cast-offs. The NFL owed them a debt, but the league was not a charity. It was fighting for survival, and survival meant putting the best product on the field. Owners faced hard choices. Some stuck with loyal veterans, unwilling to discard men who had carried them through the leanest years. Others ruthlessly cut rosters, embracing the new influx of talent. The Cleveland Rams, for example, leaned heavily on Bob Waterfield, their returning quarterback, who had avoided service due to hardship deferments. With him under center, they captured the 1945 NFL championship. In Pittsburgh, Bill Dudley returned from military duty and immediately reclaimed his status as one of the league's brightest stars, winning the NFL MVP that same year. These comebacks gave the league renewed energy, proof that it could still produce greatness. Yet the contrast between the soldiers' reality and the league's fragile economics was stark. Many veterans returned, expecting more stability, more respect, more money. After all, they had risked their lives for their country. Surely professional football could offer more than $2,000 for a grueling season. But the NFL was still small-time, scraping by on ticket sales. Owners could not pay what players felt they deserved. Tensions brewed, foreshadowing the labor struggles that would haunt the league for decades. The war also changed the fan base. Americans were hungry for entertainment, yes, but they were also more discerning. They had seen newsreels of Normandy, read casualty lists in the papers, buried loved ones. They wanted spectacle, excitement, something worth their dollar. The sloppy play of the war years would no longer do. With soldiers back, expectations rose. The the NFL had to deliver a better product to risk being dismissed as irrelevant compared to the pageantry of college football. College football loomed especially large in 1945. Teams like Army and Navy fielded squads stacked with military talent, men who were both soldiers and athletes. The 1945 Army team, led by Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, was a national sensation, steamrolling opponents and capturing headlines far beyond what any NFL team could command. Their games drew massive crowds, while NFL stadiums still struggled to fill. The comparison was brutal. If fans could watch Army-Navy for free in the stands or on radio, why pay for the war-weary NFL? The returning soldiers offered the league a chance to shift that balance. With stars like Dudley, Waterfield, and Van Buren dazzling crowds, professional football began to claw its way into the national conversation. For the first time, the NFL could argue that it was more than a sideshow to the college game. Its players were not just professionals, they were veterans, heroes who had served their country and returned to serve their sport. That narrative mattered. It gave the NFL a legitimacy it had never possessed before. But the fragility remained. Behind the scenes, owners still struggled with budgets. Stadium leases were costly. Travel remained restricted. Equipment shortages continued into 1945, making it difficult to maintain uniforms and gear. Crowds were larger, yes, but not yet large enough to guarantee solvency. Teams like the Rams and the Cardinals still flirted with disaster, pondering relocation to bigger markets as a lifeline. The war had ended, but the league's fight for survival had only shifted, not disappeared. Perhaps the greatest uncertainty of 1945 was psychological. Would America embrace professional football at all? Baseball had long been the national pastime. College football had deep roots. Boxing still commanded attention with champions like Joe Louis. The NFL was the outsider, the underdog. Its wartime struggles had kept it alive, but they had not yet made it a staple of American life. The returning soldiers brought hope, but hope alone could not sustain a league. Looking back, what strikes me is the duality of that year. On one hand, the NFL was fragile, financially unstable, fighting for recognition. On the other, it was infused with a new energy, carried on the shoulders of men who had faced death and returned unbroken. The war had stripped the league down to its barest bones, and now the returning soldiers gave it muscle again. It was still vulnerable, but for the first time in years, it had a pulse strong enough to suggest a future. And yet, one question lingered. Could the league transform that pulse into permanence? Could it grow beyond survival, beyond patchwork rosters and near-bankrupt owners, into something durable? The answer would not come overnight. It would be forged in the years after 1945 in battles for markets, fans, and financial legitimacy. But in that fragile season, the NFL stood at a crossroads, balanced between extinction and endurance. Its fate resting in the hands of men who had already given everything on foreign soil. The soldiers returned, the rosters filled, the gates swelled. But beneath the cheers lay uncertainty, a quiet whisper that the war might have ended, but the NFL's fight was far from over. The winter sun never truly warmed Cleveland on December 16, 1945. By mid-afternoon, as more than 32,000 fans shuffled into Cleveland Stadium, the wind coming off Lake Erie cut through every layer of wool and leather. Their breath froze before it disappeared. And down on the field, the turf itself had turned into something closer to polished stone than grass. This was the stage for the NFL championship game between the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Rams, a game that, in hindsight, symbolized the precarious existence of professional football in America at the end of World War II. The league could not have chosen a harsher metaphor for its survival. It was as if nature itself wanted to test whether the NFL could endure. The ground was so frozen that cleats barely bit into it. Ball carriers slipped before they could plant their legs. Quarterbacks saw their passes float like stones in the bitter wind. And yet, against these conditions, the game pressed on, because the NFL itself could not afford for it not to. Cleveland, led by owner Dan Reeves, had decided this would be their last season in Ohio. He had already plotted to move his Rams franchise to Los Angeles. Seeing opportunity in California's booming post-war market, that meant this championship would be a farewell. For Cleveland fans, it was bittersweet. They were desperate for football glory, but knew that victory, if it came, would not stay with them. Reeves, meanwhile, was focused not only on winning the title, but on selling the NFL, as future on proving that the league could be more than a regional curiosity. On the other sideline stood the Washington Redskins, coached by the fiery Ray Flaherty and led by quarterback Sammy Baugh, a man already considered a legend. Baugh's brilliance had carried Washington to multiple championships earlier in the decade. His ability to throw with touch and accuracy revolutionized how football was played, dragging the game from its grinded-out roots into something more open and thrilling. But on this day, the conditions would conspire against him. The first quarter opened with disaster for Washington. On their opening drive, Baugh dropped back near his own goal line, looking for a short pass to escape the shadow of the uprights. He lofted the ball carefully only for it to hit the icy goalpost and ricochet harmlessly into the end zone. By rule at the time, that was a safety. 2 points to Cleveland, and the tone was set. For the rest of the game, the field itself became Washington's toughest opponent. That bizarre moment has since become one of the most infamous plays in NFL history. Fans in Cleveland erupted, half in disbelief, half in laughter at their good fortune. To them, it seemed as though the gods of football had already chosen a side. But to league executives in the stands, it was another reminder of how fragile their sport appeared. In baseball, no one worried about a ball striking the foul pole and deciding a championship. In boxing, no one questioned whether the canvas beneath fighters' feet might splinter in half. Football, however, was a game still held together with tape and tradition, where the field, the weather, and even the equipment seemed one mistake away from undermining its legitimacy. Still, the Rams pressed their advantage. Their quarterback, Bob Waterfield, was not the household name Baugh was, but he was young, tough, and unflappable. He had married Hollywood starlet Jane Russell, which gave him a glow of celebrity that extended beyond football. That day, he played like a man determined to cement his own legend. He threw 2 touchdown passes, difficult, spiraling shots that cut through the frigid wind. Each one felt like a dagger, and by halftime, the Rams led 15-7. The Redskins tried to rally. In the third quarter, they clawed back into the game, with their ground attack forcing Cleveland's defense to respect the run. But every step was agony on the ice. Linemen slipped as they tried to pull. Tacklers crashed awkwardly, bodies colliding more with the ground than with each other. Players later recalled how their bruises didn't fade for weeks, the frozen surface punishing them more than their opponents ever could. The game ultimately turned on Waterfield's steady hand. With time winding down, he delivered his second touchdown pass, sealing a 15-14 victory. The Rams were champions for the first and only time in Cleveland. Fans roared in celebration, though many knew that it was hollow. Within weeks, Reeves would finalize his move west, abandoning the city that had just lifted him to the mountaintop. Looking back, the 1945 championship was more than a title game. It was a crossroads. Had the Rams lost, had the spectacle been more farce than triumph, the NFL might have limped into 1946 with little momentum. Newspapers across the country could easily have painted the league as second-rate, its rules absurd, its product unworthy of serious attention. Instead, the Rams' gritty victory gave the league a moment of narrative coherence. Football as a game of resilience, of men overcoming impossible odds, of triumph carved out of ice and pain. There's a reason historians often circle this contest as the symbolic end of one era and the beginning of another. The war was over. Soldiers were coming home. America was ready for distraction, ready for leisure, ready for entertainment on a national scale. Baseball had long dominated the cultural imagination, but football, faster, rougher, less predictable, was beginning to feel like a mirror of the country's own identity in a changing world. The Rams' decision to head west into the land of movies and sunshine embodied that shift. Even so, it was fragile. The game had been sloppy, awkward, and at times comical. Sports writers noted how the icy field made football seem like a parlor game gone outdoors. They wondered whether fans would keep showing up if such conditions persisted. For every article that praised Waterfield's poise, there was another that mocked the league's inability to control its own environment. The NFL had survived 1945, but survival was still all it could claim. The image of that frozen championship lingers because it captured the essence of the NFL's existence at the time. Precarious but stubborn, flawed but compelling. The safety off the goalpost became a metaphor for how randomness could reshape destiny. The Rams' departure for Los Angeles demonstrated both the ambition and instability of the league as franchises. And the very fact that the game was played in front of 32,000 bundled fans showed that. Despite everything, football had already started digging its roots deeper than many realized. For the men on the field, the day lived in their bones. Baugh, humiliated by the bizarre safety, never truly forgave the fluke of it all. Waterfield, meanwhile, carried his performance west, using it as proof that he could lead a team into uncharted territory. And for Reeves, that game justified every gamble he had taken, every whisper that football could become more than a minor league sport east of the Mississippi. What the league would do next, how it would respond to this narrow escape. This moment, where chaos nearly overwhelmed order, would determine whether professional football would remain a curiosity or grow into something permanent. But on that frozen day in Cleveland, as players limped into locker rooms and fans poured out into the snowy streets, the NFL had, at least for now, survived. And yet survival was not security. Even as the Rams celebrated their championship, the league's foundations were shifting beneath them. In the shadows of Cleveland's farewell victory, new forces were gathering, forces that would challenge the NFL's very right to exist, not just as a champion maker, but as the undisputed voice of professional football. In December 1945, as the Cleveland Rams basked in the glow of their icy championship and quietly prepared to pack their bags for Los Angeles, another movement was gathering strength. It didn't come from the NFL's offices in Chicago or New York. It didn't come from the boardrooms of established owners. Instead, it came from a collection of ambitious businessmen, sports promoters, and visionaries who looked at the NFL and saw not an institution to be respected, but a monopoly ripe for disruption. This movement called itself the All-America Football Conference, the AAFC, and it would soon become the most serious existential threat the NFL had ever faced. The NFL's vulnerabilities to understand why the AAFC believed it had a chance. You first have to understand just how fragile the NFL remained in 1945. The league had been around for 25 years, but its hold on the American imagination was tenuous at best. Baseball dominated the headlines and drew the big crowds. College football, with its pageantry, marching bands, and campus loyalty, still overshadowed the pros, and the NFL itself had glaring weaknesses. Small franchises in shaky markets, owners with shallow pockets, and a schedule that felt disorganized compared to the polished spectacle of other sports. World War II had nearly broken the league. Rosters were depleted, teams merged just to survive, and franchises like the Brooklyn Dodgers and Boston Yanks had flirted with collapse. Even the Rams, fresh off their 1945 title, were running on fumes financially, prompting their owner to look westward. If a rival league ever wanted to strike, this was the moment. A league of visionaries and mavericks enter Arch Ward, the influential sports editor of the Chicago Tribune. Ward was a power broker in American sports, the kind of man whose phone calls could change the direction of entire leagues. He had already founded baseball's All-Star Game in 1933, turning a one-off exhibition into a midsummer institution. Now, he set his sights on football. Ward believed professional football was ready to expand on, that the NFL was too cautious, too insular, too reluctant to seize the future. So, in 1944, he began recruiting businessmen and investors who were willing to challenge the NFL's dominance. By the end of 1945, the AAFC was officially organized, with plans to begin play in 1946. What made the AAFC different from earlier rival leagues was not just its timing, but its ambition. Backed by wealthy owners, it sought to plant franchises in major markets the NFL had neglected, to sign top college stars, and to innovate in ways that would make the NFL look stale. Its founders weren't aiming to coexist with the NFL, they were aiming to replace it. Building the roster of teams, the AAFC announced franchises in 8 cities, carefully chosen to maximize both reach and appeal. Cleveland Browns, owned by businessman Arthur B. Mickey McBride. With a coach named Paul Brown already, a rising legend from his Ohio State days. New York Yankees, financed by Don Topping, who also owned the New York Yankees baseball club. Los Angeles Dons, entering the California market alongside the Rams, but with plans to make Hollywood their playground. San Francisco 49ers, bringing professional football to Northern California for the first time. Miami Seahawks, planting a flag in the South where no NFL team had yet ventured. Chicago Rockets, daring to challenge the NFL directly in its home city. Buffalo Bisons, giving upstate New York its own professional franchise. Brooklyn Dodgers, resurrecting the NFL team name that had recently folded. This was not a scattered collection of minor markets, it was a bold attempt to establish a truly national footprint. The NFL suddenly looked provincial by comparison. Paul Brown and the Cleveland experiment of all the AAFC's moves. None would prove more consequential than the hiring of Paul Brown, fresh off his service as a Navy coach during the war. Brown was already a household name in Ohio. He had transformed Ohio State into a national powerhouse, leading them to their first national championship in 1942. He was modern, disciplined, and innovative in ways that few professional coaches had yet imagined. Mickey McBride handed him complete control of his Cleveland franchise, effectively building the team around his vision. Brown insisted on year-round preparation, detailed playbooks, classroom-style instruction for players, and strict rules about conduct. He introduced film study and began to systematize football in a way that resembled military planning more than sport. In short, the AAFC wasn't just offering competition, was offering evolution. Fans noticed. A battle for talent, the AAFC's founders knew that to gain credibility, they needed star players. So they went after them with money. NFL owners were still frugal, reluctant to pay high salaries when their margins were razor thin. The AAFC broke that mold, offering contracts that doubled or tripled what the NFL would pay. The league aggressively courted college stars returning from military service. Suddenly, bidding wars erupted for players who had once been grateful simply to have a job. The NFL could no longer dictate the market. One of the most famous coups came when the Browns signed Otto Graham, the talented quarterback from Northwestern who had served in the Coast Guard. Under Brown's tutelage, Graham would soon redefine the position, leading Cleveland to dominance. The AAFC had not only matched the NFL in talent, it had arguably surpassed it. The media and the message, the AAFC also benefited from Arch Ward's influence in the press. Newspapers gave the new league significant coverage, framing it as bold, fresh, and modern compared to the stodgy NFL. Writers emphasized its national reach, its deep-pocketed owners, and its charismatic coaches. For fans weary of war and looking for excitement in the late 1940s, the AAFC felt like a revolution. College football had its loyalty. Baseball had its tradition. But pro football, thanks to this new league, suddenly seemed glamorous and progressive. NFL's uneasy response, the NFL, for its part, could not ignore the challenge. Commissioner Elmer Layden, the former Notre Dame Four Horsemen, had been selected to lead the league in 1941. He was a decent administrator, but he lacked the ruthlessness and vision needed to counter a rival. Many owners believed he was too cautious. The Rams' move to Los Angeles in 1946 was, in part, a reaction to the AAFC's announcement of the Los Angeles Dons. The NFL had never before ventured that far west. Now, fearing the AAFC would plant its flag unchallenged, Reeves rushed his team to Hollywood. It was the first sign of how the NFL would fight not through cooperation or merger, but through direct confrontation in contested markets. Seeds of a coming war. By the summer of 1946, as the AAFC prepared to kick off, it was clear that American professional football was heading for an all-out war. 2 leagues, 16 teams, overlapping markets in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Cleveland. Bidding frenzy for players. Newspapers eager to frame the contest as a clash for supremacy. The stakes were enormous. Could the NFL, weakened by the war and mocked for its frozen championship, withstand an assault by a league that seemed younger, faster, and richer? Or would the AAFC sweep it aside and crown itself the future of American football? For players, it was a godsend. Salaries soared. Options multiplied. For fans, it promised more football than ever before, in more cities than ever imagined. But for the NFL's owners, it was nothing short of a nightmare. They had just survived their own near collapse. Now they faced the possibility of being outflanked, outspent, and ultimately replaced. The birth of the AAFC was not merely a story of expansion. It was a story of ambition colliding with fragility, of visionaries daring to seize what the old guard had left vulnerable. And as the first kickoffs approached in 1946, it became clear that professional football's future would not be determined by stability, but by survival. What followed was a clash unlike anything the sport had ever seen, a battle, not just of teams on the field, but of boardrooms, bank accounts, and visions of what professional football could become. The AAFC and the NFL would spend the next 4 years locked in a war for legitimacy, and the outcome would shape the destiny of the game itself. The year was 1946, and professional football had never seen anything like it. 2 leagues, each claiming to be the future of the sport, prepared to face off in a contest that stretched far beyond the gridiron. For the first time, the NFL's survival would not be determined by gate receipts or wartime rosters, would be determined by its ability to withstand a rival with equal ambition, deeper pockets, and a vision of the game that felt more modern than anything the old guard could muster. The NFL versus the AAFC was more than a scheduling conflict. It was a collision course, and the sparks that flew during those first years revealed just how fragile the entire sport still was. A nation hungry for football, America in 1946 was a nation in transition. The war was over, millions of soldiers were coming home, and the mood of the country was shifting toward optimism. Baseball had long been the national pastime, but football, college and professional alike, was beginning to capture imaginations. College stadiums were filling with fans eager to see young men who had just served their country now strapping on helmets for one more chapter. And for many of those players, professional football offered a chance to keep competing while earning enough to support their families. The NFL had believed for years that it owned that pipeline. But now, with the AAFC offering higher salaries and fresh opportunities, the monopoly was broken. The sport was no longer a one-league show which a battlefield. Market overlap. The fight for cities. One of the AAFC's boldest strategies was planting franchises directly in the NFL's backyards. In New York, the NFL Giants had been a fixture since the 1920s, run by the influential Mara family. But now they faced competition from the AAFC's New York Yankees, backed by Dan Topping, who also owned the baseball Yankees. The Yankees brand carried instant recognition, and their games at Yankee Stadium gave them a stage as grand as the Giants. In Chicago, the NFL's Bears and Cardinals suddenly had to contend with the Chicago Rockets. financed by a group that included Hollywood investors. For a city already divided between two NFL teams, the arrival of a third franchise created chaos. The market was oversaturated and attendance was spread thin. But for the AAFC, it was a statement. We will not avoid your strongholds, we will storm them. In Los Angeles, the NFL's Rams and the AAFC's Dons prepared to duel in a market that had never seen big league pro football before. Reeves had rushed the Rams west to prevent the Dons from owning Hollywood unchallenged. And the city became a laboratory for whether professional football could thrive in the sun-drenched glamour of California. Even in Cleveland, the AAFC's Browns instantly overshadowed the NFL's Rams, who had already left town for Los Angeles. Paul Brown's machine-like precision, his innovative strategies, and his ability to recruit elite talent made the Browns the talk of the Midwest. For many fans, the AAFC team felt more legitimate than anything the NFL had ever fielded in that city. By 1946, 4 of America's largest football markets had become direct battlegrounds. It was a recipe for both excitement and disaster. The bidding wars. At the heart of the rivalry was money. The AAFC's owners were not afraid to spend, and in many cases, they were wealthier than their NFL counterparts. They began signing top college players to contracts that dwarfed what the NFL was offering. Take the case of Charlie Trippi, the Georgia star who had dazzled fans during the Rose Bowl and military service games. The bidding wars rippled through every roster. Established veterans suddenly discovered that they could leverage the threat of signing with the AAFC to demand raises. Rookies weighed offers from both leagues like prized recruits. For the first time, professional football had a labor market in which players, not owners, held the upper hand. The quality of play, what surprised many observers, was how quickly the AAFC matched hand. In some cases, exceeded the quality of NFL play. The Cleveland Browns, under Paul Brown, were the clearest example. In their first season, they dominated the AAFC, finishing undefeated in the regular season and capturing the championship. Otto Graham emerged as a passing star. Marion Motley bulldozed defenders as a running back. And the team's discipline and innovation stunned fans used to more haphazard styles of play. Sports writers began openly questioning whether the Browns could beat the best teams in the NFL. The AAFC was not just competition, it was a mirror held up to the NFL's flaws. Instability in the AAFC for all its successes. However, the AAFC carried its own weaknesses. Some of its markets proved unsustainable. The Miami Seahawks, playing in a city unaccustomed to professional football, struggled to draw crowds and collapsed after just one season. Other franchises faced financial instability, burning through owner capital as attendance lagged behind expectations. The league's ambitions sometimes outpaced its reality. Having 8 strong teams was one thing. Having 8 profitable teams was another. And in the battle for legitimacy, any sign of weakness gave the NFL ammunition. NFL's countermeasures. The NFL did not sit idly by. Commissioner Bert Bell, who replaced Elmer Layden in 1946, proved far more aggressive. Bell had been a co-founder of the Philadelphia Eagles and a longtime football man. He understood that survival meant adaptation. One of his boldest moves was implementing the NFL draft lottery system, ensuring that weaker teams had access to top talent in order to maintain competitive balance. It was a way to stabilize the league while reducing the appeal of jumping ship to the AAFC. The NFL also began to modernize its own promotional efforts, taking cues from the AAFC's media-savvy approach. Rivalry games were hyped, stars were spotlighted, and attendance gradually improved. For the first time, the league realized that it could no longer take its audience or its monopoly for granted. Fans caught in the middle for fans. The rivalry was both thrilling and confusing. Newspapers debated endlessly over which league was superior. Cities with overlapping franchises forced fans to choose sides, sometimes splitting households. Some loved the NFL's tradition. Others were drawn to the AAFC's innovation. Attendance figures reflected the tension. In some markets, like Cleveland and San Francisco, the AAFC outdrew the NFL. In others, like Chicago and New York, the established NFL brands maintained an edge. What was clear was that professional football, once dismissed as a second-rate attraction, now commanded national attention in a way it never had before. The cost of war, but beneath the excitement, the financial cost was immense. Owners in both leagues were losing money, locked in a spending war that neither could sustain indefinitely. Salaries soared beyond ticket revenue, and some franchises teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. This was not a sustainable business model, it was a war of attrition. The question was no longer whether the NFL or AAFC could survive independently. It was how long the sport itself could survive with two leagues cannibalizing each other. The collision of 1946-1948 revealed both the promise and the peril of professional football. For the first time, the sport captured national headlines, expanded coast to coast, and elevated its quality of play. But it also exposed just how fragile the entire enterprise remained. As the rivalry intensified, one truth became unavoidable. Two leagues could not coexist forever. Something would have to give. And when the dust settled, the outcome would not only decide who controlled professional football, it would redefine what the sport would become. By 1947, the football landscape in America had transformed into something bordering on chaos. For the first time in the sport's history, there wasn't one recognized big league, but two. The NFL and the AAFC were engaged in a war of attrition, with rosters, markets, and dollars as their ammunition. What had begun as an ambitious challenge had spiraled into an all-out fight for survival. At the center of this conflict stood one team that embodied the new order and exposed the old league's vulnerabilities: the Cleveland Browns. Their dominance became the AAFC's greatest weapon, the crown jewel that forced the football world to admit, sometimes reluctantly, that the upstart league might not just be an equal, but superior. Cleveland's relentless machine, the Browns, were more than just a football team. They were a system, a program, almost a military operation. Paul Brown treated his players not as rough-and-tumble freelancers, but as disciplined soldiers executing a plan. He introduced playbooks and classroom instruction, tools that few professional coaches had ever considered. He held practices with precision timing, emphasizing fundamentals and preparation. On the field, the results were staggering. Quarterback Otto Graham combined poise with pinpoint accuracy, quickly establishing himself as one of the most efficient passers in the sport. Running back Marion Motley, at 238 pounds, was nearly impossible to tackle once he gained momentum. And his presence shattered racial barriers in professional football. Alongside Motley was fullback Marion Speedy Davis and ends like Max Speedy and Dante Lavelli, who stretched defenses in ways NFL teams struggled to match. In the AAFC's first 4 seasons, Cleveland won every championship. They went 12-2 in 1946, 1-1-1 in 1947, 14-0 in 1948, and 9-1-2 in 1949. Their dominance was so complete that it forced comparisons with the NFL's best. Sports writers debated endlessly. Could the Browns beat the Chicago Bears? Could they outplay the Giants? The consensus increasingly leaned toward yes. For the NFL, this was more than a public relations headache. It was an existential crisis. If the AAFC's flagship team was better than the NFL's best, then what did that say about which league represented the pinnacle of the sport? The financial strain, but while the Browns thrived on the field, the broader AAFC experiment was cracking under financial pressure. Markets like Miami and Brooklyn faltered quickly. Attendance failed to match the optimistic projections that had convinced investors to pour money into franchises. By 1947, some AAFC teams were bleeding red ink. The Miami Seahawks were sold and moved to Baltimore, reborn as the Colts. The Brooklyn Dodgers franchise collapsed entirely, unable to compete with both the Giants and Yankees in the same city. In Buffalo, crowds were loyal but too small to keep pace with the escalating salary war. The NFL wasn't immune either. Its owners were forced to raise salaries to keep pace with the AAFC, cutting into already thin margins. Some franchises, like the Chicago Cardinals, could afford the spending spree thanks to wealthy backers. Others struggled to stay afloat. The duplication of teams in major cities split fan bases and weakened gate receipts, leaving both leagues wobbling financially. By 1948, the war had entered a dangerous phase. The NFL and AAFC were both winning small battles, but both were also losing money at alarming rates. Expansion of the game, yet even amid the instability, the rivalry transformed professional football. The two-league system expanded the sport's footprint into places it had never been before. San Francisco, Baltimore, Buffalo, and Los Angeles all gained permanent attachments to professional football during this period. The war also forced innovation, with the Browns setting new standards of preparation and execution. Other teams, both AAFC and NFL, began modernizing their own operations. Playbooks grew thicker. Kite training regimens became stricter. Passing strategies became more sophisticated. Players benefited as well. Salaries rose across the board, and the presence of two leagues gave them leverage that hadn't existed before. For the first time, professional football was a viable career path rather than a temporary job after college. The fans noticed. Attendance overall increased despite the instability, as more Americans flocked to stadiums to see what this new professional football looked like. Though some franchises struggled, the sport itself was becoming part of the national conversation in ways it never had before. The NFL's response, the NFL, under Commissioner Bert, recognized the gravity of the moment. Bell was pragmatic, often blunt, but he understood survival. He strengthened the league's financial rules, pushed for competitive balance through the draft, and insisted that the league present itself as the established, permanent institution in contrast to the AAFC's volatility. Bell also sought to stabilize weaker NFL franchises, helping the Philadelphia Eagles grow into contenders and working to keep struggling clubs afloat. He understood that perception mattered. If too many NFL teams folded, the league would look no stronger than its rival. Meanwhile, the Rams' successful relocation to Los Angeles gave the NFL a narrative victory. They became the first major pro sports franchise on the West Coast, beating the AAFC's Dons to the punch. For a moment, the NFL looked like the bolder, more ambitious league. But on the field, the Browns and the AAFC kept stealing headlines. Pressure to prove themselves. By 1948, the football world clamored for a showdown. Could the Browns or any AAFC team defeat the best of the NFL? The question became unavoidable, a drumbeat in the press that undermined the NFL's claims of superiority. The Browns, undefeated that season, looked almost untouchable. Otto Graham threw for over 2,700 yards, and Motley continued to dominate defenses. Paul Brown's system seemed to produce results no matter the opponent. Too many fans. The Browns looked like the true kings of professional football 11 if their championships weren't recognized by the NFL. The pressure mounted on Bert. Writers accused him of protecting his league from embarrassment by refusing to allow inter-league competition. Bell deflected, claiming the NFL had no reason to validate a rival. But behind the scenes, he knew the league could not dodge the question forever. The cost of dominance, ironically, the Browns' dominance also hurt the AAFC, while Cleveland drew massive crowds. Other franchises struggled because the outcome of the league felt predetermined. Fans in Buffalo or Chicago had little hope of competing with Paul Brown's juggernaut, and attendance in those cities sagged. In trying to prove the AAFC's superiority, the Browns had also exposed its imbalance. One team was clearly elite. Several others were struggling to survive. A league built on competition now faced the problem of predictability. Toward a reckoning by the late 1940s, both leagues were nearing exhaustion. Owners on both sides were hemorrhaging money, weary of the constant bidding wars, and frustrated by dwindling profits. Players were thriving, but the institutions themselves were under siege. Talk of a resolution began to surface. Some owners advocated for a merger, while others pushed for the collapse of the weaker league. Fans speculated endlessly about what form professional football's future would take. Would the AAFC force the NFL into submission? Would the NFL outlast its upstart rival? Or would the two somehow join forces to save the sport from imploding? What no one could deny was that the war had changed football forever. The sport had grown in popularity, expanded its reach, and modernized its play. But the cost of that progress was threatening to consume both leagues. By 1949, the AAFC and NFL could no longer ignore reality. The war that had once energized fans and players now threatened to bankrupt the entire system. A resolution was no longer a matter of if, but when. The reckoning was coming. And when it arrived, it would take the form of negotiations, concessions, and one of the most consequential mergers in sports history. But before peace could be found, the leagues had to confront just how close they were to mutual destruction. The war for professional football's soul was coming to its final act. By 1949, the NFL had spent nearly 4 years fending off the rival All-America Football Conference. It had endured raids on players, bidding wars that doubled salaries, and headlines that questioned whether the old league could survive at all. Owners grumbled about expenses. Coaches feared they'd lose their rosters. And fans, in some cities, didn't even know which league they were supposed to support on Sundays. But history rarely bends toward stalemate. Something had to break. And what finally emerged was not so much a truce as a reckoning and admission that neither side could sustain the war forever, and that only one structure could stand tall enough to define the future of professional football. The All-America Football Conference entered its 4th season still brimming with talent. The Cleveland Browns, guided by the brilliant Paul Brown, had dominated the league, winning all 4 AAFC championships. Their precision, discipline, and modern approach had reshaped the sport. The San Francisco 49ers and the Buffalo Bills had shown flashes of elite play. The Los Angeles Dons gave California a second team in the country's fastest-growing market. And yet, beneath the glitter, cracks widened. Attendance sagged in weaker cities. The Brooklyn Dodgers of the AAFC failed to capture New York's loyalty. The Chicago Rockets wilted under the shadow of both the Bears and the Cardinals. And while television was beginning to whisper promises of national reach, neither league had secured the kind of broadcast contracts that could float to competing empires. Money was bleeding away, and owners knew it. In meeting rooms and smoke-filled hotels, the talk shifted from conquest to survival. Bert Bell, the NFL commissioner who had once been considered an interim caretaker, sensed the tide turning. Bell had been underestimated often in his career, but in this moment, he became the bridge. He understood that football could not fracture forever, not if it wanted to become America's game. Bell began reaching out quietly, gauging whether the warring sides could lay down their arms. The AAFC owners were divided. Some, like Arthur "Mickey" McBride in Cleveland, knew their franchises could hold their own in any league. The Browns had embarrassed NFL teams in exhibitions, proving their worth beyond debate. Others, like Buffalo or the Chicago Rockets, had no illusions. They were drowning financially. Paul Brown himself admitted later that even Cleveland's dominance could not fix a league hemorrhaging money. "We were fighting a battle nobody could win," he reflected. For the NFL, the calculus was equally tricky. They didn't want to reward every AAFC team. Expanding too quickly risked diluting talent and spreading markets too thin. But they couldn't ignore Cleveland, San Francisco, or Baltimore, the strongest of the AAFC franchises. Bell's genius lay in balancing preservation with concession, folding the league into the NFL, but on the NFL's terms. The negotiations were tense. The AAFC pressed for as many of its teams as possible to be admitted. The NFL held firm. Finally, in December 1949, the deal was struck. 3 AAFC teams would join the NFL: the Cleveland Browns, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Baltimore Colts. The rest would be dissolved. It was both a merger and a funeral, a moment of birth and death in the same breath. When the announcement hit newspapers, it was clear how dramatically the landscape had shifted. For the first time since the Depression, the NFL had not just survived a rival, it had absorbed one. Unlike the fates of the old AFL of the 1920s or the second AFL of the 1930s, this was not a story of extinction. It was consolidation, with the strongest elements of the challenger now embedded inside the parent body. The symbolism could not be overstated. Cleveland, fresh off its 4th straight AAFC title, would now walk directly into the NFL and challenge the old guard. Fans wondered aloud, were the Browns merely champions of a second-rate league, or were they truly the best team in professional football? The answer came swiftly, in one of the most stunning moments in league history. On September 16, 1950, in their first official NFL game, the other admitted teams left marks of their own. San Francisco began building the kind of West Coast loyalty that would anchor the NFL's future expansion. Baltimore struggled financially, but planted a flag in a region that would eventually grow into one of the league's most passionate markets. The sacrifices were real. The Buffalo Bills of the AAFC, beloved by their community, were erased, leaving fans devastated. But the larger truth was undeniable. Pro football was now unified under one roof. The economics began to stabilize. Without the costly bidding wars, salaries could be managed again. Owners breathed easier. Bell pushed ahead with policies that strengthened the league's cohesion. Revenue sharing for the new television contracts, stricter scheduling balance, and a draft system that truly functioned. What had once been a fragile collection of franchises was now a single, growing organism. Yet the scars of the war lingered. Some AAFC owners felt betrayed. Buffalo fans never forgave the NFL for abandoning their city. Even within the surviving franchises, adjustments were painful. Players cut from the folded teams scrambled to find spots on NFL rosters, their careers hanging in the balance. But as the dust settled, a new reality took shape. Professional football was stronger, richer, and more compelling than it had ever been. Looking back, the merger of 1949-1950 was not just a business arrangement. It was the moment when the NFL shed its last shadows of instability. Before, it had always been haunted by collapse. In 1945, it nearly folded under wartime strain. In 1946, it nearly bled out against the AAFC. But by 1950, after weathering the storm and seizing the best of its rival, the NFL emerged as something new. It was no longer merely a league, it was a foundation. The Cleveland Browns would win the NFL championship in their very first season in the league, validating not only Paul Brown's genius, but the legitimacy of the AAFC. That triumph sent a message that echoed through the next decades. Innovation could not be ignored, and survival was not enough. The NFL had to evolve or be humbled. The deal struck in December 1949 was supposed to be the end of conflict. In truth, it was a beginning. The league had learned that rivals would always come, some louder, some bolder, some with deeper pockets. But it had also learned that with shrewd leadership and a willingness to absorb change, the NFL could endure. It was a lesson that would be tested again in the 1960s, when another AFL rose to challenge its supremacy. For now, though, the league savored its unity. For the first time in a generation, there was only one banner of professional football. The battles of the 1940s had scarred it, but they had also forged it into steel. The NFL of 1950 was no longer a shaky collection of teams hoping to survive another season. It was an institution, hardened by war, ready to grow. The storm of the AAFC had passed, but the horizon held new clouds. Expansion, television, labor unrest, and cultural change would soon demand answers the league had never before faced. And history shows, every time the NFL grew stronger, it was because it had walked to the edge of collapse and stared into the abyss. The merger was proof. Survival was never guaranteed. It had to be fought for, earned, and defended. The NFL's story of 1945 to 1950 was not one of inevitability, was one of fragile endurance, of battles won only at the cost of nearly losing everything. And now, as we step beyond the merger and into the uncertain dawn of the 1950s, the question looms: how would the league take this fragile stability and transform it into true dominance? The year 1950 was not simply the start of another season. It was the dawn of something the NFL had never truly experienced before: stability. For the first time since its founding in the 1920s, professional football entered a decade without a rival league pulling at its seams. The battlefield of survival gave way to a new frontier growth. But growth brought with it new questions, and one force in particular would reshape every answer: television. When the Cleveland Browns stormed into the NFL and captured the 1950 championship, the message was clear: professional football had never been more compelling. Paul Brown's machine-like precision, Otto Graham's command under center, and Marion Motley's bruising dominance told fans that this was not the rough novelty sport of the Depression years. This was entertainment. This was spectacle, and entertainment needed a stage. That stage would not only be stadiums packed with 40,000 or 50,000 fans. The real arena was the American living room. Television, once a futuristic curiosity, was rapidly becoming a household presence. In 1947, fewer than 200,000 American homes had a television set. By 1954, that number exploded past 26 million. A sport once confined to local markets was suddenly staring at the chance to reach a nation. But the NFL had a problem. Baseball still ruled the airwaves. The World Series was the crown jewel of sports broadcasting, and the rhythm of summer and fall was built around the diamond. College football, too, had already begun experimenting with television, though the NCAA feared overexposure. The NFL, strapped for resources, had never truly mastered the art of promotion. Survival had consumed its energy. Now it needed to sell itself. Commissioner Bert Bell saw it before many others did. Bell had been cautious with radio contracts in the 1930s, knowing that gate receipts were the lifeblood of fragile franchises. But by 1950, the math had changed. A full house in Philadelphia or Green Bay could save a team's season. But a national broadcast could introduce the league to millions who had never bought a ticket. Bell moved cautiously but deliberately, allowing teams to strike local television deals while keeping one eye on the horizon of national contracts. One of the first hints of television's power came on December 23, 1951, in the NFL championship game. The Los Angeles Rams faced the Cleveland Browns in the Coliseum, and for the first time, a professional football title was broadcast coast to coast. An estimated 30 million viewers tuned in, many seeing the NFL for the first time. What they witnessed was a thriller. Norm Van Brocklin's 73-yard touchdown pass to Tom Fears sealed the Rams' 24-17 victory, crowning Los Angeles as champions and igniting a westward vision of football's future. Those who watched that day didn't forget it. Football, with its bursts of violence and strategy compressed into 60 minutes, fit television in ways that baseball's languid pace did not. Camera angles captured the brutality of the line, the soaring arc of passes, the collisions that echoed in helmets and pads. In a living room, the sport felt bigger, not smaller. And in that revelation lay the seeds of dominance. But progress was uneven. Not every owner embraced television. George Halas of the Chicago Bears, ever the cautious steward of his empire, worried that free broadcasts would kill attendance. He was not alone. Teams in smaller markets feared that if fans could watch from home, they would stop paying for tickets. Bell worked to reassure them, arguing that television would not replace the stadium, it would advertise it. Slowly, the resistance faded. Meanwhile, the product on the field was changing. The Browns' entrance forced the NFL to modernize its style. Passing grew sharper, playbooks deeper, and coaching more scientific. The league could no longer rely on brute collisions to hold attention. It needed artistry. Quarterbacks like Van Brocklin, Bobby Lane, and Graham became the faces of the game. Wide receivers like Tom Fears gave television cameras stars to follow down the sideline. The combination of improved play and expanding broadcasts began to pay dividends. Attendance across the league rose. By 1955, the average NFL game drew over 30,000 fans, a number unimaginable during the Depression years. The league's reputation shifted too. Once dismissed as a sideshow to college football, the NFL was gaining cultural traction. Cities that had once treated pro players as second-class citizens now recognized them as heroes in their own right. Still, challenges remained. The Baltimore Colts, admitted in the 1950 merger, folded after one season, unable to support themselves financially. It was a sobering reminder that unity did not guarantee security. The league retracted to 12 teams and carried on. For fans in Baltimore, it was heartbreak. For the NFL, it was a lesson. Growth would have to be carefully managed. But for every setback, there were breakthroughs. The 1958 Colts, reborn under new ownership later in the decade, would eventually deliver the greatest game ever played. A television milestone that would cement the NFL's future. Yet even in the early 1950s, the contours of destiny were already visible. By mid-decade, a new wave of owners and executives began to see football not just as a sport, but as a product. Television sponsors wanted drama, personalities, and narratives. Teams like the Rams leaned into glamour, playing under Hollywood lights with stars like Elroy Kraslegs, Hirsch. Others leaned into grit, selling their toughness as authenticity. The league was learning how to tell stories not only in stadiums, but across living rooms from coast to coast. In retrospect, the early 1950s represented a fragile but essential turning point. If the league had squandered television's rise, baseball might have remained unchallenged as America's game. If the Browns had flopped in the NFL, critics could have dismissed professional football's experiments as gimmicks. But the opposite occurred. The Browns legitimized innovation. Television magnified spectacle. And fans responded in numbers that stunned even the league's optimists. By 1956, the NFL signed its first nationwide television deal with the Dumont Network. Though modest in dollars, it represented a philosophical breakthrough. The league was no longer just a gate-driven enterprise. It was becoming a broadcast product, a form of mass entertainment with limitless potential. The story of the NFL's survival in the 1940s was a story of near-death, of clinging to existence against forces that threatened to erase it. The story of the early 1950s was different. It was about awakening. The league, battered but intact, was discovering not just how to survive, but how to thrive. The transition was subtle at first, almost invisible, but those who lived it felt the ground shifting. As one sportswriter observed in 1953, baseball fills our summers, but football is beginning to fill our hearts in the fall. That sentiment, quietly voiced, hinted at what was coming. America was changing faster, louder, more mobile, and more captivated by spectacle. And football, carried into living rooms by glowing screens, was aligning itself perfectly with that change. The NFL had survived the 1940s by sheer resilience. In the 1950s, it began to grow by vision. And yet, beneath the success, another battle loomed, one, not with a rival league, but with forces inside its own structure. Players were beginning to question their treatment, their pay, and their health. Labor unrest, long muted by fear, was stirring. The unity of owners was not always matched by fairness to those on the field. The next great test of the NFL's character would not come from outsiders. It would come from within. By the spring of 1945, with Germany's surrender looming, and Japan still locked in brutal resistance, the question wasn't just whether football could survive another season. It was whether the sport could prove itself worthy of the nation's attention at all. In those months, every industry in America was being asked the same thing. What role do you play in the survival of this country? For steel, coal, and shipbuilding, the answer was obvious. For football, it was murkier. The league was not essential to victory in the war, but was it essential to the spirit of the people? That was the argument being quietly made by executives, owners, and players alike. I think often of Elmer Layden, the NFL commissioner at the time. Layden had been one of Notre Dame's legendary Four Horsemen, a name etched into the very mythos of the sport. By 45, he wasn't remembered for his galloping runs, but for his ability to steady a league standing on uneven ground. Layden was pragmatic, serious, a man who believed in order, above all. He insisted that football could serve as a thread of continuity in a nation being torn apart. Football has a job to do, he told reporters. It will not interfere with the war effort. It will strengthen it. His words were carefully chosen, almost defensive, because he knew that the league's survival depended on public opinion as much as financial solvency. The reality was stark. Rosters were still gutted. Teams relied on players who were past their prime, or so young they barely understood the speed of the professional game. Many men played both was offense and defense not because it was a strategic choice, but because there was no one else to fill the lineup. In Cleveland, the Rams scraped together a roster of part-timers, while the Chicago Cardinals suffered through seasons that bordered on farce. To some, the NFL had become a second-rate enterprise, a hollow imitation of the game it once represented. And yet, in cities where the games still kicked off on Sunday afternoons, people came. They filled wooden bleachers and concrete stands, bundled in coats, hungry for something normal, something American. It's worth pausing to consider what the word normal meant in 1945. Normal was ration books and gas shortages. Normal was writing letters to loved ones you might never see again. Normal was keeping one ear glued to the radio for news from Okinawa or Iwo Jima. Against that backdrop, the sight of men colliding on a muddy field was more than entertainment. It was reassurance that not everything had been swallowed by the war. For returning soldiers on furlough, watching a game reminded them of the lives waiting for them at home. For families in the stands, it was a momentary reprieve from grief and worry. That was the unspoken value of the NFL in 1945. Still, the league knew it could not coast on sentiment alone. Money mattered, and the numbers were troubling. Travel expenses were astronomical because railroads were overburdened and commercial flights were limited to the military. Equipment shortages forced players to reuse pads and helmets well beyond their intended lifespan. Owners debated openly whether it was even worth staging a season in 1945. Some argued the league should suspend operations until the war ended, rather than risk a complete financial collapse. But suspension carried its own danger. If fans forgot the NFL existed, if college football reclaimed the stage entirely, professional football might never recover. This was the crucible in which the modern league was forged, it in moments of triumph, but in those of desperation. Layden and the owners ultimately decided to press forward with the 1945 season, a decision that would prove fateful. That year, the Cleveland Rams, one of the league's most unstable franchises, staged an improbable run. Led by quarterback Bob Waterfield, they captured the NFL championship. It wasn't just a victory for Cleveland. It was a victory for the entire league, proof that the sport could still produce drama, heroes, and stories worth telling. But the story of 1945 was not only about the gridiron, it was about the invisible battles behind the scenes. Newspapers of the era revealed just how fragile public trust was. A misstep, a perception of frivolity in wartime, could have destroyed the league's credibility. Owners had to frame football as a patriotic act, a service to morale. They partnered with war bond drives, held halftime ceremonies honoring local servicemen, and ensured that no one mistook their games for selfish indulgence. Football is not a diversion from war, one advertisement proclaimed. It is a reminder of what we fight to preserve: Looking back, I'm struck by the paradox. The NFL, a league built on competition, violence, and spectacle, survived 1945 not by doubling down on its brashness, but by humbling itself. It became smaller, quieter, almost apologetic in tone. In doing so, it bought time for the war to end, time for players to return, time for the nation to remember what it felt like to cheer without guilt. And when that moment came, when victory was declared in August of 1945, football stood ready. The league had not folded, though it came perilously close. Instead, it had endured, like a ship battered but not sunk. That fall, as G's returned to American soil, they found the NFL still standing, waiting to become something larger than anyone had yet imagined. What fascinates me most about that year is how little separated survival from extinction. A few bad financial decisions, a few empty stadiums. A few more owners deciding to cut their losses on the NFL might have disappeared altogether. The great dynasties, the Super Bowl era. The billions in television revenue, the cultural dominance, all of it would have been nothing more than an unrealized dream. But history bent the other way. The league clung to life in 1945, and in that clinging, it discovered its own resilience. That resilience became part of its identity, part of the mythology that would later fuel its rise. The NFL was not just a sport, was a survivor. And that survival, I think, is what gives the story of 1945 its haunting power. Because in the silence of those wartime Sundays, when players lined up on threadbare fields and fans huddled against the cold, no one knew for certain whether they were watching a dying tradition or the faint heartbeat of something waiting to be reborn. By 1946, the war was over, and America stood at the edge of an entirely new era. Cities bustled with energy. Soldiers returned home with medals on their chests, and the nation's gaze shifted from survival to possibility. But for the NFL, the end of the war was not the end of struggle. In fact, it marked the beginning of an even greater challenge. How to transform a league that had barely survived into one that could truly thrive in a peacetime America defined by ambition, entertainment, and competition. It's tempting to see 1945 as the end of the danger, the moment when the NFL had cleared the storm. But history rarely works so neatly. Survival and stability are not the same thing. Yes, the league had made it through the darkest days of wartime austerity. But the next question was whether professional football could carve out a permanent place in the fabric of American life. Whether it would fade into obscurity, overshadowed by baseball, college football, or the emerging entertainment industries that clamored for attention in the post-war boom. I've always been struck by how fragile the league still was at that moment. There was no guarantee of dominance, no certainty of success. What the NFL had was momentum, a heartbeat strong enough to carry it forward, but not strong enough yet to silence doubt. The decisions made in the immediate aftermath of World War II would determine whether football remained a niche curiosity or evolved into the empire we know today. One of the first realities the league faced was the sheer flood of returning players. Thousands of men who had once played college or professional ball now returned from the military, eager to reclaim their place on the field. This created both opportunity and tension. Rosters that had been padded with semi-pros and walk-ons during the war years were suddenly overflowing with talent. Coaches faced difficult choices, cutting men who had kept the sport alive during the war in order to make room for the stars who had worn helmets before Pearl Harbor. The talent pool was richer than ever, but with it came rivalries, egos, and the challenge of integrating players who had endured unimaginable experiences overseas. Some players returned stronger, hardened by combat. Others came back broken, their bodies scarred, their spirits carrying the weight of battles far heavier than anything on a football field. There are stories some buried. Some whispered of veterans who lined up for training camp but couldn't stomach the sound of pads colliding, the crack of helmets. It reminded them of artillery fire, of loss, of a world they desperately wanted to leave behind. For them, football was no longer a game. it was a ghost. The NFL had to navigate this reality with care, though in those years, sensitivity was not yet a word often used in locker rooms. At the same time, the league faced pressure from outside. A new challenger was on the horizon: the All-America Football Conference, a rival league that promised better salaries, wider markets, and a more glamorous vision of the sport. For the first time, the NFL's monopoly on professional football was under direct threat. And yet, this competition may have been the very thing that forced the NFL to evolve. To hold its ground, the league had to modernize. It had to expand beyond its old conservative instincts and embrace the reality that professional football was no longer a sideshow, it was becoming a national attraction. Teams began investing more in promotion, in better stadiums, in courting fans not just as attendees but as a loyal audience. This was the beginning of football as spectacle, though it was still years away from the full power of television. I can't help but think about the cultural context here. In 1946, America was entering what would become the golden age of sports, driven not only by athletics, but by media. Baseball was still king, boxing was massive, and college football had deep traditions that dwarfed the NFL in prestige. For professional football to rise, it had to distinguish itself, and it did so by leaning into its own brutal honesty. Unlike baseball, with its nostalgia and romance, football was unflinching. It was about collisions, endurance, and survival, the very qualities that resonated with a nation fresh from war. There's a quote from sports writer Grantland Rice that I often return to. Reflecting on the post-war game, he wrote, "Football is the test America understands best. It is strength meeting strength, courage meeting courage. It is the echo of a nation that does not shrink from hardship." That sentiment captures why football found fertile ground in those years. The war had toughened the public's imagination. People didn't just want distraction, they wanted reflection. They wanted to see, on a field, the kind of grit they believed had carried them to victory overseas. And so the NFL leaned into that imagery. Rosters filled with veterans were celebrated not just as athletes, but as warriors come home. Stadium ceremonies honored their service, programs told their stories. And the game itself became a kind of theater of resilience. When men crashed into each other at the line of scrimmage, fans saw more than sport. They saw symbols of a national will that refused to bend. But there were cracks beneath the triumph. Owners quarreled about money and market share. The league office still lacked the centralized power it would later wield. Teams came and went, some folding, some relocating, leaving uncertainty in their wake. The war had not erased the instability that haunted professional football, it had merely delayed it. The path forward was still fragile, and one misstep could have unraveled everything the NFL had fought to preserve. What fascinates me about this moment is the sense of brinksmanship. The league was not yet the juggernaut it would become. It was still a gamble, still a dream more than a guarantee. Every Sunday in the late 40s carried that tension. Was this the beginning of a new age? Or just the final flicker of a fragile experiment? Looking back, we know the answer. But the men living it didn't. They played, coached, and cheered in uncertainty. Unaware that they were laying the groundwork for a cultural empire, the NFL of 1946 and beyond was not inevitable. It was fragile, contingent, born from desperation and stubbornness. And it carried with it the DNA of 1945, the memory of survival. Against odds so steep that collapse seemed a likelier outcome. That is what makes this chapter of history so extraordinary. The NFL we know today, with its billion-dollar broadcasts and sprawling stadiums, exists because, in those lean years of war and uneasy peace, enough men believed it was worth saving. They believed in the idea of football, even when the reality was threadbare, dangerous, and uncertain. That belief was the bridge between survival and dominance. And in the end, that bridge would carry the NFL into an entirely new era, not of desperation, but of ambition. The final years of the 1940s carried with them a sense of unfinished business. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered. Cities rebuilt, soldiers raised families, industries boomed, and America surged into what many called the Age of Prosperity. But beneath that golden promise, the scars of conflict remained etched into the national psyche. And in that liminal space between recovery and reinvention, professional football found its footing. The NFL had come dangerously close to extinction in 1945. A single bad season, a single fold of another cornerstone franchise, and the league could have vanished into the margins of history. We would remember it today only as a curious experiment, a sporting venture that couldn't withstand the weight of global catastrophe. Instead, through stubbornness, ingenuity, and sheer resilience, it clawed its way forward. What makes that survival remarkable is that it wasn't guaranteed. Nothing in those years was inevitable. The league's survival was a series of narrow escapes, fragile truces, and desperate improvisations. I think often about the dual nature of the league's legacy in those years. On one hand, the NFL of 1945 was a testament to survival at all costs. Teams fielded lineups with men too old, too young, or too untested, yet they played anyway. Franchises operated in the red, scraping together enough cash to keep the gates open, to pay their players something, anything, for their sacrifice on the field. The product wasn't polished, the stability wasn't real, but it was alive. That was enough. On the other hand, the war years revealed the league's vulnerability. It was not yet an institution. It was not yet inevitable. It was fragile, subject to forces beyond its control. A single economic downturn, a rival league, or the loss of public interest could have toppled it. In that fragility lies the true drama of the era. Because what we now see as destiny was, at the time, only possibility. The post-war years would ultimately provide the stage for transformation. Returning veterans injected the league with skill, toughness, and a sense of national heroism. The rise of the AAFC forced the NFL to sharpen its identity, to expand its reach, to think bigger than survival. And the coming of television, a force still in its infancy, promised a platform that could turn Sunday afternoons into ritual, into spectacle, into shared experience. But none of that would have been possible without 1945, without the year when everything almost collapsed. There's a truth about sports that often gets lost in the highlight reels and the myth-making. It's the truth that greatness often begins in desperation. The NFL's climb to dominance was not born in boardrooms or billion-dollar contracts. It was born in scarcity, in lean years where men risked their bodies for meager paychecks, where owners prayed for just enough fans to keep the lights on, where every Sunday felt like a referendum on whether professional football even deserved to exist. That crucible forged a resilience that would carry the league through every future challenge. The men who lived it, players, coaches, owners, fans, couldn't have known what their struggle would yield. To them, it was day-to-day survival, a fight for relevance, a hope that the sport they loved would not vanish. And yet, from their persistence came something larger than themselves. They handed down to the next generation a league no longer on the brink, but ready to dream. It's important to reflect on what might have been. Imagine a world where the NFL folded in 1945. Baseball would have reigned uncontested. College football would have held the mantle of the nation's favorite fall pastime. The cultural language of America would be different. There would be no Super Bowl Sundays, no dynasties, no pantheon of names etched into the fabric of the nation. No Vince Lombardi, no Joe Montana, no Tom Brady. Without those fragile wartime years, the entire trajectory of American culture shifts. That's the weight of the story we've traced in this documentary. It's not just about the survival of a sport. It's about the endurance of an idea that the struggle on the field reflects something deeper in the American spirit. Football in those years was a metaphor for the nation itself, battered, stretched thin, doubted by many, but unwilling to surrender. As I think back on the stories players who returned from war only to strap on helmets, coaches who coiled together lineups with whoever was left, fans who showed up even when the product barely resembled the game they loved, I see not just the survival of football, but the survival of belief. Belief that something fragile could endure. Belief that something small could grow. Belief that from the edge of collapse could come the foundation of greatness. That belief is what carries forward to every Sunday we know today. The packed stadiums, the national broadcasts. The global reach, all of it stands on the shoulders of those lean, uncertain years. The NFL today is an empire, but empires are not born empires. They are built stone by stone, often in moments when collapse seems certain. For the NFL, 1945 was that moment. And from it, they built something that has defined American culture for generations. I return, finally, to the question that has haunted this story from the beginning. What does it mean that the league almost folded? To me, it means that survival matters as much as success. That the measure of greatness is not only in the heights reached, but in the depths endured. The NFL's dark years were its crucible. Its triumph was not in avoiding collapse, but in rising from the edge of it. And so, as the lights dim on this chapter of history, what lingers is not just the memory of close calls and narrow escapes, but the realization that what we now take for granted was once almost lost. The NFL's last chance became its first step toward destiny. And from that fragile year of 1945, a sport found its permanence, a league found its future, and a nation found its game. Looking back across this journey, I keep returning to one central truth. The NFL as we know it should not exist, at least not in the way it does today, an empire of billion-dollar contracts, global audiences, and cultural rituals so embedded in American life that Sundays feel incomplete without them. When we trace its story back to 1945, when the league hovered on the edge of extinction, we confront the fragility of even our most cherished institutions. What seems permanent now was once held together by little more than stubbornness, faith, and a refusal to fold. The story of 1945 was not glamorous. It was not heroic, in the way highlight reels often try to package history. It was desperate. Teams patched together rosters with anyone who could take a snap. Owners struggled to scrape enough money to pay their players. Stadiums emptied out, profits vanished, and the very idea of professional football seemed to teeter on the edge of irrelevance. It was survival in its rawest form. And yet, survival is sometimes enough. Because when the league endured, when it refused to disappear, opened the door for transformation. The NFL of today is built on that refusal. Every touchdown, every dynasty, every Super Bowl spectacle carries in its DNA the echo of 1945. The year when everything almost collapsed. That brush with oblivion hardened the league, taught it resilience, and forced it to adapt in ways that would define its future. I think of the men who carried the league through those years. Players who left factories, farms, or barracks to strap on leather helmets, knowing they were risking their bodies for meager pay. Coaches who spent sleepless nights searching for enough healthy bodies to field a team. Fans who showed up out of loyalty more than spectacle, filling seats not because the product was great, but because the game mattered to them. Their commitment stitched the NFL together when it was falling apart. They didn't know they were preserving the seed of something monumental. They just refused to let it die. The league's survival through World War II was not the end of its struggles, but it was the defining test. Out of that crucible came a vision of what professional football could be. The arrival of rival leagues, the post-war flood of talent, the coming of television, these challenges and opportunities would push the NFL to expand, modernize, and eventually dominate. But without the survival of 1945, none of that would have mattered. The NFL would have been another footnote, another failed venture in the crowded landscape of American sports. That, to me, is the emotional core of this story. Because when we watch the NFL today, it is easy to see only the spectacle, the billion-dollar stadiums, the global broadcasts, the dynasties and the legends. It's harder to see the fragility underneath the fact that it almost wasn't. And that fragility changes the way we understand the league's legacy. It reminds us that what we take for granted today was built on risk, uncertainty, and survival against the odds. The NFL's near collapse also forces us to reconsider what it means to endure. In sports, we often celebrate dominance, the undefeated season, the unstoppable team, the dynasty. But survival is its own form of greatness. To endure when everything seems stacked against you. To push forward when collapse feels inevitable. To hold the line when the world tells you to fold. That was the story of the NFL in 1945. It was not about gloriette, it was about grit. And grit, in its purest form, is what built the league's future. There's a broader lesson here, one that transcends football. Institutions, like people, often face moments of reckoning, moments when survival is not guaranteed. What carries them through is not certainty, but conviction. For the NFL, that conviction came from players who believed the game was worth playing, owners who believed it was worth saving, and fans who believed it was worth watching. That belief carried the league across its most fragile moment and into permanence. And yet, the survival of 1945 also leaves us with questions. What was lost in the process? What sacrifices were made? The league endured, but at what cost to the players whose bodies bore the brunt of it? To the communities whose teams folded? To the men who gave their all for a game that paid them so little? Survival is rarely clean. It is messy, painful, often unfair, and the NFL's survival was no exception. That complexity is part of its story too. When I reflect on the NFL's legacy, I don't just see the triumph. I see the fragility that preceded it. I see the line of possibility stretching in two directions, one where football becomes America's game, and another where it fades into obscurity. The fact that we live in the former reality is not destiny, is contingency. It happened because enough men in 1945 refused to let the game die. That refusal is the heartbeat of this story, and it is what makes the NFL's rise so compelling. Because the league we know today, the empire of spectacle and dominance, sows its existence to the leanest of years, when survival itself was the only victory that mattered. In the end, the story of 1945 is not just about football. It is about resilience. It is about the fragile line between collapse and endurance. It is about the belief that something small, something vulnerable, something doubted can endure long enough to become something permanent. That belief carried the NFL from the brink of extinction to the pinnacle of American culture. And so, as we close this chapter, we return to the central paradox. The NFL almost folded in 1945. It was, by every measure, the league's last chance. But from that last chance came a first step toward destiny. From that fragile survival came permanence. From the edge of collapse came the foundation of greatness. That is the dark truth and the enduring legacy of the NFL's most fragile year.